Up until July, Damian Collins was the Conservative MP for Folkestone and Hythe, as well as being a significant figure in Parliament over the last 14 years, leading inquiries into fake news and disinformation, as well as helping steer through the Online Safety Act. He's also a very good historian. His latest book, Rivals in the Storm, is about David Lloyd George, Britain's leader during the last 2 years of the First World War. What struck me reading Damian's book is the threads connecting Lloyd George's time with ours. So many of the ways in which government and diplomacy work today are due to what one person called Lloyd George's bureaucratic entrepreneurialism. There's also issues like political realignment and the power of media barons, in our case, social media barons. I hope you enjoy our talk. Damian, thank you very much for agreeing to be a guest.
My pleasure.
I always like to start with my Inside the Actors Studio questionnaire. So, Damian, what is your favourite word?
Visceral.
What is your least favourite word?
No.
What is your favourite swear word?
I don't really have one.
I mean, the follow-up was going to be, are there any notable times in your parliamentary career that you've used it?
No, I've never sworn in Hansard. There are some colleagues who've got pretty close to the wire with some of their expressions, but I think Penny Mordaunt probably has done best in that regard.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw that Kamala Harris almost used her favourite swear word against Donald Trump yesterday.
I didn't see that, no.
So she said before that her favourite swear word is motherfucker.
Right.
So there was a moment where she sort of said this former president. What is your favourite book?
If it's a novel, probably Tale of Two Cities.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
Quite a few. I think what's always a really nice sound is when you're in the countryside in the summer, you just hear, because there's a slight breeze, you hear no noise, there's a slight sound of the trees waving. That's quite a nice sound.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
I hate that kind of like nails down a blackboard type sound.
Do you have any guilty pleasures?
I suppose watching football.
Are there any fictional characters that you imagine yourself to be?
No, but I think it's sort of a strange question, because I think you think of different phases of your life. You can think of scenarios in books. You think, well, that would have been quite cool, but you grow out of them. Some of them.
So I've always been fascinated by the sort of little known but incredibly influential fixers in sort of political history. Sort of people like Lord Esher and Philip Sassoon. Your first book was a biography of Sassoon, who acted as a bit of a fixer for both Field Marshal Haig and Lloyd George. So I was curious if working on that book was what led you to write Rivals in the Storm.
It led me to Lloyd George in part, yeah, for sure, because I didn't know a huge amount about Lloyd George other than what you cover in the studying history, kind of like People's Budget, First World War. And what I was interested in was Sassoon's working style. In fact, actually, take a step further back from that. Where the Sassoon book started was when I was Member of Parliament for Folkestone and Hythe. His estate at Port Lympne was in the constituency, and I was visiting Port Lympne as a kind of like constituency MP visit. They were talking about the business and what they were doing there, and they were talking about these things they called the Hythe conferences, which were a series of conferences Philip Sassoon hosted for Lloyd George, mainly with the French government, a kind of modern form of country house summit diplomacy. And what I didn't really understand was that Sassoon, rather than being this slightly Gatsby-esque figure, in fact, in terms of influence of books, I deliberately wrote the prologue to the Sassoon book as kind of like rather the scene in The Great Gatsby of the the description of arriving at one of Gatsby's parties and say, I had always seen him as this kind of Gatsby-esque figure, but I hadn't realised he'd been quite so central to politics at the time and very close to so many influential people. So his work with Lloyd George sort of introduced me to Lloyd George. And then when COVID's lockdown started, Ian Dale had asked me if I'd write a chapter for his book of essays on prime ministers. And I'd agreed with him I'd do Lloyd George, mainly because I thought I'd written quite a lot about Lloyd George in the Sassoon book, so it would be quite an easy one to do. And I suppose that then was the kind of started me on the road to writing the Lloyd George book. But in some ways, what's interested me, though, I mean, I think interesting you say you're interested in the kind of role of these sort of behind-the-scenes fixers, the people who grease the wheels of politics, is what I tried to do with Rivals in the Storm was not just write like a cradle to grave biography of Lloyd George, but a book really focused on the kind of the political pressures and influences that surrounded him and his interrelations with other senior figures at the time, both in government and in the military and in the media. And it's it's really a story of the power of those relationships and how those forces both brought people together and then separated them.
I mean, the book did grip me from the start just because it very much plops you right into the maelstrom of the beginning of the First World War and this sort of I think something that's always interested me about Lloyd George in the First World War is that it's much less static than I guess the Second World War. After 1940, pretty much the politics is static, the diplomacy is quite static except for the summits, whereas in the First World War there's much more maneuvering, there's a lot of open questions, I guess because the military situation was quite static, so the diplomatic and the political was much more fluid.
Yeah, so I think also what's interesting, I think when you delve into the First World War is we've got a sense, I think, a little bit of sense from history that the First World War was this sort of awful conflict that, as you said, was actually very static. It was terrible in terms of the sacrifices and the deaths and the conditions the men had to live and fight in. But that basically we slugged it out and eventually Britain and France won as they were always going to do. Just a question of how long would it take. And when you actually go back and look at it, you see that they had to invent the idea of total war on the go. They had no idea what they were getting into. I mean, the British Army goes into the First World War as an army of men and horses and comes out of the war as a mechanized armed force. The idea of no one had any idea of how many, not how many men you would need, the equipment you would need, the armaments you would need, how they'd be manufactured, that you'd have to build factories that didn't exist to meet the demand. All these sorts of things had to be done on the go. And that there were various points in the war where people thought we were going to lose and actually actively were losing. And the political pressures that created, both within the government and between politicians and the generals, is huge. And Churchill benefited enormously in the Second World War from seeing what Lloyd George had gone through and Asquith before him in the First World War. So from the start in the Second World War, you get conscription, rationing, you get the planning for a total war, you get the a politically unified cabinet, small war cabinet, and a close integration of strategy between the generals and the politicians. And none of those things existed in the First World War. They all had to be created and under enormous pressure. And I think that is an interesting story. And I think for anyone who's fascinated by, Churchill's role in the Second World War, I think they should look back to the influence I think Lloyd George had from the example he set in the First World War.
I mean, that kind of touches on something else that's always interested me about Lloyd George in the First World War, and you touch a lot on it in the book, which is sort of the strategic tension between Lloyd George and the military high command. And I've always felt that Lloyd George was sort of right about so many aspects of how the Allies should fight the war, whether it was sort of how best to organize industry or the need for conscription, the need for a small war cabinet to take decisions quickly, creating a sort of unified military command across the British, the French, and the American armies, as well as how sort of out of their depth Haig and Robertson were in terms of fighting this sort of modern conflict. But I've also thought that Haig and Robinson were correct, that the only way to win the war was by defeating the German army on the Western Front. So I've always wondered sort of how things might have played out if Lloyd George hadn't spent so much political capital trying to spend British troops and munitions on Greece or Italy or Palestine, but had agreed to sort of the focus on the Western Front, but then used his skills to better sideline Haig and Robertson.
It's interesting. I mean, it's a couple of sort of massive topics in a way, both of which would deserve a book on their own. But so I think firstly on the kind of the Westerners versus Easterners, it's interesting. You see the similar sort of issue being discussed in Ukraine at the moment around the incursion into Russia. Is that diverting resources away from the main front, or is it, will it stretch the Russians? Does it create a way around, or is it just a distraction? And that was what they discussed in the First World War. That people like Haig and Robertson believe that the war can only be won on the Western Front, and that all the resources should be focused on there, even if that is attritional, even if that is about wearing down the Germans until they collapse. And Lloyd George and Churchill in particular were always interested in what Lloyd George called the way around, and they had different ideas on that. So, Gallipoli and the Dardanelles campaign was one such idea. That was Churchill's idea, and their contention was always that if that had been done quickly and as a surprise, it may have succeeded, but it was a costly failure. Lloyd George's was Salonika, the landing at Salonika to reinforce the defence of Serbia and Greece, and an invasion through the Balkans that was strategically important, not just because it would undermine Germany's allies in the Balkans and Austria, but it would cut off supply routes into the Ottoman Empire, both to and from the Ottoman Empire. And I mean, Lloyd George's kind of belief that might have worked was that it sort of did in the end, not with very limited British involvement, but with a kind of Serbian revival in 1918, where with a relatively small number of forces, they effectively knocked Bulgaria out of the war and the Balkans sort of collapsed. So Lloyd George always thought that maybe could have worked with a bit of resource. And what they were really arguing for was before a big battle, you could reinforce the Western Front to hold the line, have enough there to stop the enemy breaking through. But with the excess, you could plan other campaigns. The great example he gave in 1917, this incredible speech, which I set out in some detail in the book, in November 1917 in Paris, where the Battle of Passchendaele was drawing to a close. He highlighted the enormous losses there to capture, as he said, a shattered village on a ridge. Whereas the Austrians had this enormous breakthrough at Caporetto against the Italians, taking 200,000 prisoners of war, capturing a huge amount of materials. And he said, well, if we'd had a success like that on an easier to fight front, like in Italy, rather than the huge losses we've had on the Western Front for tiny gains, that might have been a better use of resources. So it's an unresolved question because the war wasn't won in that way. Ultimately, the war was won on the Western Front by, I think for lots of different reasons. I think it's not just about manpower, but supply. The British Army was, and this is where I think Lloyd George and his government deserved a lot of credit. The British and Allied forces on the Western Front were just far better equipped and supplied than the Germans were. They could supply the front lines more efficiently, and that helped them win there. So it is right that the war was won in the West, but the way around could have been a success. Could have been, so you can understand as well after the war, people looking back on it at the enormous loss of life, and were considering could it have been done differently. But then, of course, Lloyd George's contention on the West was that for a lot of the politics in the First World War, there were real dangers the war could be lost on the West, that without bringing in conscription quick enough, we wouldn't have enough men. Without the massive investment in armaments, we wouldn't have the materials and supplies needed to win.
I mean, that November speech, it framed a question that I'd never really thought about before, of although the fronts were different and the armies were different and the defensive positions were different, the way Lloyd George sort of posits that contrast of the British High Command are sort of satisfied if the front line moves a few miles and captures unimportant things, and yet why are our enemy able to advance hundreds of miles, capture so many things, and sort of why should we be satisfied with these very limited gains that the Haig and Robertson are so satisfied with? I'd never sort of seen it before framed in that way.
Well, yeah, and his suggestion as well, his implicit suggestion throughout this period that not just that the Germans seem to be doing more, the enemy seems to be more successful in what it captures for its resources, it expends. Well, certainly that he was comparing Passchendaele with Caporetto, well, that was certainly the case. But he also has this sense that he thinks the French generals are better than the British generals. And in some ways the French generals have more experience of commanding big continental armies. I mean, Haig was a very successful soldier, but his career had been fighting colonial wars. In open terrain and he was a cavalry officer. So where the cavalry was the secret weapon.
It's the Blackadder joke.
Yeah, and in some ways the British start the First World War really fighting, like as is always often the case in politics. People fight the last war, so the British go in equipped to fight the Boer War again. Rather than so they go in with shrapnel shells, which were very effective in the Boer War, but not very effective against an entrenched enemy. So they've got the wrong equipment, not enough of it, not enough men to fight it. And Lloyd George, his suspicion that he thinks the French generals are more effective, and that causes a lot of upset with Haig and the British generals because he seems to be asking those questions. But I think Lloyd George was right on unity of command, and one of the reasons he pressed for it was that he thought the problem is that different generals wanted their great offensive to be the one that won the war. So Haig was not that interested in diverting too much resource to support the French generals in their campaigns because he wanted his battle to be the winning blow. And the concern that in battles like Passchendaele, it was pursued for too long because Haig was determined to have a victory and that the generals moved the goalpost during battles as well, so that the initial objective of Passchendaele, which was the breakthrough and capture of the German ports on the Channel coast, instead became refined on slogging up the ridge at Passchendaele and taking that, and they didn't stop till they did. And of course, what Lloyd George didn't know, which he talks about in his war memoirs, was that there were lots of people who thought it was a totally wrong strategy, and that the battle shouldn't have been fought. It should have been stopped much earlier. And Lloyd George's frustration was that was never that intelligence and that insight was never shared with him in the war cabinet.
My last interview was with the historian Anna Reid about her book about the British intervention in the Russian Civil War. And something that struck me reading her book is how basically the Allied effort in Russia was partly undermined by the lack of a unified command between the various sort of Allied forces, because I guess it was so underdeveloped on the Western Front that I guess the idea of translating it across into Russia was just inconceivable. So that you had a similar situation of Czechs and British and Americans and French basically all doing their own thing, just because the evolution of it that you eventually got in the Second World War was just no way. No.
Well, no, because the Second World War, unity of command is there from the beginning, and in fact, then even later on in the preparations for D-Day, Eisenhower is the supreme commander of Allied forces in Western Europe. So, and Lloyd George pushes for unity of command, which the French are all for, and it's resistance within Britain from the generals, and then the generals whipping up opposition from the king and from their friends in Parliament and the press as well. And it's only the infrastructure to support the unity of command is created from pressure with Lloyd George, but it's not until the crisis in the spring of 1918, in the face of the Great German Offensive, where they think they might lose the war, where there's this meeting in the town hall at Doullens, where the unity of command is created and Foch is put in command, and everyone goes with it. And that was then seen as a totally necessary thing to do. But I think it would have been much harder to have made that decision at that time had Lloyd George and others not pushed for the infrastructure to be created, the secretariat and staff to be created to support unity of command. And it makes sense in a way that even if your allies fighting a war, ultimately you have to have a central strategy and central objectives and agrees of how you're going to work with each other, rather than basically people doing their own thing, in different sectors of the line.
Yeah, I guess I've always found it's one of the obvious reasons everyone remembers Churchill and sort of everything like that. And yeah, I sort of feel that a lot of, say, modern British government, modern Western diplomacy and military alliances like NATO all kind of owe a huge debt to Lloyd George and sort of the innovations he brought to governing and institutions and bureaucracy.
Well, yeah, and I think that it's interesting, you've referred to governments as well as the kind of military leadership, and that before the First World War, they were seen as very different things. In a way, governments might have to decide if a country was going to go to war or not. But once that decision had been made, before the First World War, the politicians, their job was to write the checks, and leave the soldiering to the professionals. The idea that strategy would require political support, which in some ways is important because you've got to take the country with you in this endeavour as well. And the politicians are ultimately responsible in a total war where the whole nation is involved rather than a small group of professional soldiers. And that was a new and those are things are understood now, both in the way in which wars are fought and planned for, but also in the existence of international organizations like NATO and the United Nations, that there is inevitably the political and the military have to work in step together. We have to, agree what our objectives are. We have to agree how they're going to be supplied and met, and there has to be a common strategy. But that's seen as normal now, but it was something Lloyd George had to fight to create, and in the middle of a world war.
I mean, there's a great Clemenceau line I like, which is "War is too important to be left to generals."
Yes. And the kind of the insight that really amused me was a story about after the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, one of the first British offensive operations in 1915, where it becomes apparent that because we don't have the right shells or enough of them, what could have been a decisive breakthrough is squandered. And there are various reports back to Lord Kitchener about this, one from Lord Esher, who you mentioned earlier on, and the other from Arthur Lee, who was also one of Kitchener's sort of emissaries. And Lee goes back to the War Office to tell Kitchener that this is what's happened. And Kitchener sort of explodes with rage at the idea that, that they've been firing too many shells, and the idea that the British soldier can't advance unless the enemy's been battered into submission, insensibility by shell fire. He just thinks is absurd, and they just don't understand what it is. And Lloyd George can't understand when he goes to see Kitchener and says, "I'll give you what you need," that Kitchener says no, he doesn't want that many.
I mean, I remember there's a line about whatever Kitchener tells you need, double it and then double it again.
Yeah, that's right.
There were a couple of bits in the book that reminded me of a back and forth that Lord Ricketts and I had a few years ago. Frances Stevenson, who was Lloyd George's sort of longtime mistress and eventually second wife and advisor, she said that the Paris Peace Conference brought out all Lloyd George's political skills. That ability to correctly assess the environment, judging people's strengths and weaknesses, what they want, what they say they want, what they really want, any subtle shifts in balances of power, hiding his own agenda, misdirection, gently coaxing people. A few years ago, Lord Ricketts and I were sort of debating, are politicians natural strategists? And sort of he felt that they're not. The tactician, they can be very good tacticians. They're very focused on the day-to-day without thinking or really caring about the long term. Whereas I sort of feel that many politicians are strategists. They have a very clear idea of what they want, which is to win election and accumulate power. And they're constantly assessing how day-to-day events help or hinder that. But what I think is rare, especially in recent years, is politicians being able to carry over those skills into governing or diplomacy the way that Lloyd George could.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think he is an example of how politicians can be strategists, and with two phenomenally complex negotiations, Versailles being one, Ireland later being the other. And I'll say a little bit about both. On Ireland first, what Lloyd George can see is that there has to be a settlement on Ireland, that the Conservative Party and the Unionists in Northern Ireland will never accept a settlement that coerces Ulster, that forces Ulster into Irish Home Rule and government from Dublin, that the nationalists in the South will must have self-government, and the question is to what extent Northern Ireland is separate from Southern Ireland, where the boundary is set between the two of them. And what he recognises is that there's enough in it for both sides, for both to be content. If Northern Ireland can have home rule within the empire, as well as Southern Ireland, then that's probably enough for both. Both sides will feel it's an incomplete settlement, but what he recognised, the status quo wasn't possible. nor was the extremes of what both sides wanted. But you could give both people enough of what they wanted that it would be enough they could take home to their people and say, okay, this is what we've got. And also what Lloyd George was very good at was always suggesting that things may change, things may evolve. So on Ireland, he said, well, we'll have a boundary commission. We'll set the board. So we'll agree now in principle, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have partition. We'll agree down the line exactly where the border goes. And of course, things may change in the future. There's always been a hope things may move. But what he was good at was recognizing what people's bottom line was and where the scope for a deal was, even if that was tiny. But he never lost sight of the strategic objective that a settlement had to happen. And I think in Versailles, he's balancing the French desire to have a massively punitive peace on the Germans, the Americans' view that there shouldn't be one, that the Germans, the peaceful reconstruction requires being nice to Germany, and a view in Britain that the British people want some money back from the Germans. So he's trying to balance that so that the settlement is enough for France, that Wilson gets his league. He recognises what Wilson really cares about is the League of Nations. Wilson gets his League of Nations. France gets a sort of a tough peace. Lloyd George intervenes to make that peace slightly less tough than the French wanted it to be. Bit of watering down there. And he very cunningly deploys his strategies on Wilson to redefine what reparations should be based on, to include war pensions, which is the cost for France is the devastated areas being rebuilt. The cost of Britain is the loss of shipping and war pensions and benefits. And so he gets that included as part of the war debts. And so he subtly gives Clemenceau and Wilson enough of what they want and keeps what he wants for himself. And then also makes massive gains to the British Empire, with territorial gains in modern-day Iraq and the Middle East, for oil exploitation rights and things like that, which he can see are not priorities for the others, but are for him. And so I think he again sort of manages to play people off against each other, but he's got a very clear sense of what he wants to achieve in these negotiations, what his strategy is, and that you've got to give the others enough that they can go back to their people and say, this is what we got out of it. And I think that where negotiation often falls down is when the person who feels they're holding the cards is too tough on the other protagonists and they can't bring them to agreement. And Lloyd George was great at getting other people to agree with his schemes, but in order to serve his strategy, not theirs.
There was a really good interview with Amal Rajan was interviewing Tony Blair a couple of weeks ago. And Tony Blair made the point about the Good Friday Agreement that you just kind of made about Lloyd George, which is that the Good Friday Agreement doesn't actually resolve the main argument between unionists and nationalists of should Northern Ireland be part of unified Ireland or should it be part of the UK. It just provides alternative means for resolving that issue than violence. And I guess it's sort of similar to what you just said about Lloyd George. He's not trying to solve that argument. He's just trying to provide an alternative means.
Yeah, because he's in the sort of before the Irish negotiations start, and Lloyd George, Churchill says that the strategy of the government flipped from we'll have the murder gang by the throat, to peace and reconciliation, and what Lloyd George recognises the choice that the government has in late 1920 is basically full martial law in Ireland. Which you could put 100,000 men into Ireland, but you'd have to keep them there, and England and the British government would be, derided around the world, for its actions in trying to pacify Ireland. Just as we see in modern conflicts, governments who try and do that sort of thing get criticised for it, whatever their justification for doing so. And so that's the choice: is we do that, or we have to have a peace settlement. And if we have a peace settlement, we can give the Irish home rule, but we can't coerce Ulster because. And he could say to the Irish leaders, well, I can't get it through Parliament. So my government can fall in the process of trying, but then you'll have to negotiate with the Conservatives who'll give you even less. So, and I think that's what he once he's made the decision that in that case in Ireland a settlement has to be made, it's about then recognising that there are constraints on what can be done, because of the very entrenched positions other people have. But even with that, there's a way of accommodating them which makes a deal possible. And I think the Good Friday Agreement is a good comparison because, the strength of the Good Friday Agreement has been peace. Not perfect peace, but largely peace. And probably the biggest defence we have against a return to the Troubles is peace. The people have been living with peace for a long time now. They don't want to go back to the way things were before.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I love Lloyd George is this ability to. He really knows how to read people in a way that most, although it's kind of should be a main skill of a politician, he's just a master at it at many others. And there's a really good line about, so another fixer that's always interested me is Colonel House. And David Lloyd George kind of once said the thing about how House is, he'd make a very good ambassador, but not a foreign minister, because he doesn't know, he's always trying to get an agreement, whatever the agreement is. It doesn't matter what the principles are or what's agreed. So long as there's an agreement between parties. Whereas in Lloyd George's view, a really good statesman has a bottom line that he wants, and will nudge everyone else to get there.
Yeah, he's very good. That's a technique in for people who are fans of Mad Men. There's a technique Don Draper uses as well with pitching to clients, is that if he's pitched some work and they can't agree and everyone's arguing about it, he just stands up and says, okay, well, you don't want this stuff, and I'm going to go, and you can't have this work I presented. It's not for you anymore. And then they go, oh no, hang on, sort of, and then, and Lloyd George is quite good at sort of the getting up and walking, the move to break negotiations. So on Ireland, he basically sets an arbitrary deadline where the settlement will be reached, and if it's not reached, it's war. And he believes that he's conceded enough that the Irish will say, okay, we'll sign. And at Versailles, he does something similar as well, where he says, okay, I want these concessions in the treaty to the Germans, and you should know that if you try and enforce the treaty as it stands now, if you make the Germans sign it, the British government won't come in and support military action against Germany if they don't sign. So, if you reckon you can do that by yourselves, then go ahead and do it. But we're not going to, this is the agreement we think is fair. And if we can't get that, we won't defend what you're pushing for. And, he does do that. He knows when he thinks the time is right to push for a settlement where everyone is basically there, but they require a nudge to get them over the line. And he's pretty adept at providing that one. He's also, the other thing as well is it's not like he's just a good reader of people in a room. Although Keynes says that he had this extraordinary ability, Lloyd George, to interpret the body language and moods of people in a way people like President Wilson just couldn't do. But he invested a huge amount in kind of human intelligence as well. So the reason people like Lord Esher are particularly important at this time, as indeed people like Philip Sassoon, is that Lloyd George loves sending emissaries, out to sort of sound people out, get a sense of what they think, where their kind of deal point is before the negotiations even start. And that's hugely important to him. And that's constantly referred to as these, not very secret agents, but friends, political allies who go out and scout the ground before Lloyd George arrives.
I think there was a bit in the book where I think when he was either just became Minister of Munitions or Minister of War, and he was visiting Paris for a conference, and ahead of time he sent people out to find out what the French political scene was like, who was up, who was down.
Yeah.
Even before he was Prime Minister, just trying to get that knowledge.
Well, that's right, because if you understand where the pressure that the person you're negotiating or working with is under, what constrains them from either doing what they want or you want them to do, then you can think through what the solution to their problem is as well as your own.
Why then did Lloyd George fall? Like, what was that tip?
So he became... it's quite interesting. If you look at the way he became Prime Minister, what he recognised in a way that Asquith didn't, I think in early 1915, he recognised this, was the war was going to last longer than the end of that year. There had to be a general election by December 1915. It would be 5 years since the previous one. And therefore, if you went through that point, you'd probably have to create a national government and bring the Conservatives in. And anyway, the Conservatives were probably going to have to come into the government at some point. So he invests hugely in his relationship with leading Conservatives like Bonar Law and Balfour. And therefore, he plays a very prominent role in the formation of the first coalition in 1915 when the Conservatives do come in. In fact, it is Lloyd George and Bonar Law that basically agree there has to be a coalition, and they go to Asquith with a fait accompli. And you see then throughout the period from then up to the point where Lloyd George becomes Prime Minister, he is continually working with leading Conservatives and Unionists to drive through the agendas he thinks are important and basically saying to Asquith, you've got to go along with this, otherwise we're going to resign. Now, that, and then through that, it brings in the senior press barons behind him, because he's supporting causes that they believe in, like conscription in the army and resolving the Shells crisis that had been exposed in the press. And he builds up, on the way to becoming Prime Minister, this huge network of support, cross-party and cross-media. When he becomes Prime Minister, that starts to splinter and fall apart, because one of Lloyd George's, I think, real vices is that ultimately, to be close to him and work with him, you have to be 100% loyal to him. And he burns people when they're not, and he lets people down, and people become disillusioned with him because of that. As I think after the war, when he'd won the war, I think he definitely becomes more autocratic, more dismissive of dissent in other people. And even people who've been very close friends of his, people like George Riddell, the press baron, who really supported and helped build up Lloyd George and support his finances, those relationships become more distant. When he really relied on Bonar Law to keep the Conservatives bound into the coalition. And when Bonar Law retires, the people that succeed him are close to Lloyd George, but they don't have the same control of the Conservative Party. So Lloyd George has become more distant and more autocratic, more interested in foreign affairs, resolving Ireland, more distant from the House of Commons, hardly in the House of Commons that much in the last couple of years of his premiership. He's reliant on other people who aren't necessarily very good at delivering that political support for him. And, then through 1922, a series of political crises, an economy that's doing badly, the kind of debit side against the government is racking up that any government would have found difficult. And the Conservatives, who disagree with him many Conservatives disagree with him on Ireland, disagree with him on his social programs and other things, dislike the political scandal over selling honours. They sort of come to a view which is, well, I think we might as well just go for it on our own, try and get elected as a Conservative Party in government without Lloyd George. What does he really add anymore? Do we really still need him? He doesn't have that magic touch he used to have. And those those networks he'd established, which bound his old political enemies to him so closely, had become weakened and then split. And so I think it unravels really, the kind of this incredible way in which he built together this network of enemies and rivals. The extraordinary thing that it's his enemies that put him in power rather than his friends. His old friends then become his enemies, and then how that all unravels and disintegrates. And I think it's partly him. It's the kind of the allure that he has, the attraction that he has as a energetic force, the man who can see things that others can't see and do things that other people can't do. But it burns people out over time as well.
I started reading Tony Blair's new book the other day, and he makes a point that most leaders go through two phases. The initial phase is they don't know much about government or power or how to handle it. So they're very curious. They're always asking questions. They're always solicitous of advice or supporters or anything like that. And then the second phase is when they transition to, they've been there so long that they think they know everything. So they just start acting much more autocratically, or my way or the highway. And that's where things tend to sort of crumble.
And that definitely happens with Lloyd George. However, what he always recognised was that he needed a party. He's very unusual. He was the first Prime Minister since the Victorian era who'd become Prime Minister without being leader of a political party. The interesting thing about the Liberals, I think, the interesting thing comparing the Conservative parties, although often sort of, complicated way the Conservative Party works, or sometimes chaotic way the Conservative Party works, it does have a very strong survival instinct in a way that I think the old Liberal Party didn't. If you compared Lloyd George to Churchill, Churchill becomes Prime Minister in 1940 in a similar way to Lloyd George, similar but different, in that the country recognises there has to be a change, that the former Prime Minister is not cutting it, has lost the confidence of the House and the nation. And Churchill becomes Prime Minister when he's actually actively disliked and distrusted by huge elements of the Conservative Party. Lloyd George ousts, seizes power, as Churchill later described it, pushes Asquith out, becomes Prime Minister principally with the support of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party to an extent, and a rump of the Liberals, but by no means all of them. Now, in 1940, Chamberlain dies at the end of the year. Churchill is made leader of the Conservative Party, and the Conservative Party recognises that he's the head of the government. He's he's got the country through a difficult first 6 months. He's the leader of the nation. Therefore, he's de facto the leader of the Conservative Party. The Liberals never do that with Lloyd George. You'd think maybe after the First World War had been won and Lloyd George was the hero of the nation, if that Asquith would have taken a step back and recognised that the first place truly was Lloyd George's. But they never do that. And the Liberal Party remains split and unreconciled. And Lloyd George knows that's a source of weakness for him all the time. And I didn't realise till writing the book just how hard he tried to create a new political party out of the sort of middle ground bulk of the Conservative Party and the Lloyd George Liberals. And he almost knew that was a necessary prerequisite to sustaining himself as a leader of a party of government that is fused under him. And it fails, largely because there is a moment where the Conservatives will do it, apart from the diehards who would have broken away, but the Liberals won't go with it. And so in the background to all the sort of major political governing decisions he's making, is an attempt to try and create a new political movement around him, which he fails to do. And ultimately it's the reason why he can't carry on.
I was curious, when writing about sort of the fall of Lloyd George's government and the Parliament, the mass of the parliamentary Tory party removing its support and so everything like that, did you draw on your experiences during Johnson and Truss's downfalls? Did they help you write that passage?
I think these. I mean, what's interesting. I think maybe this does draw a bit of comparison with maybe Boris Johnson's fall, but for different reasons. I mean, there are quite a few read acrosses between Boris and Lloyd George, although very different people. What you see, I think, with Lloyd George in particular, I think the interesting group that I think make the split with Lloyd George possible, because the famous Carlton Club meeting where the Conservative Party votes to end the coalition with Lloyd George in 1922 and go it alone. The leaders of the Conservative Party wanted to back Lloyd George. Austin Chamberlain and Lord Birkenhead were recommending to the meeting another general election with Lloyd George as head of a coalition party, effectively, and that the Conservative and a recognition that really, if that happened, that would be fusion between Lloyd George and the Lloyd George Liberals in the Conservative Party. That and the leadership of the Conservative Party are recommending that. But it's the kind of, the expression we would use today, it's the kind of young Turks. It's the next generation of Conservative leaders, people like Neville Chamberlain and Sam Hoare and Stanley Baldwin, who say no. Lord Halifax, well, he wasn't Lord Halifax then, but the man who became Lord Halifax. And they are outside the cabinet. Well, Baldwin wasn't, but he was a new and slightly peripheral member of the cabinet. They've got their own ambitions, they've got their own agenda, and they see this wartime government and its leaders as being part of the past. And they organise, and I think they're the ones that make it happen. There are various people like Baldwin and Bernard Law that give the big speeches in that meeting. But it's that mobilisation of a generation of people that make the change happen. And that in a parliamentary system, if you've got a mobile and coordinated and active caucus within a political party, then any that's acting against the leader of that party or that government, then that leader's got to be aware. Got to be aware of it and beware of it as well. And so I think that is timeless in a way, and certainly I think you also get a sense from within Parliament of, that these groupings, these personalities, the group, which I did a talk at the Hay Festival earlier in the year with Nick Thomas Symonds, who's now the member of the Labour government. And we did this panel together talking about his book about Harold Wilson and mine about Lloyd George. And he'd read my Lloyd George book as I'd read his. And he said the bit in the Lloyd George book that he totally recognised, and I do too, was this organisation called the Monday Night Cabal, which is quite a key group that are very, very influential in making Lloyd George Prime Minister, who had dinner on Monday nights and as a private dining club when the House was sitting. Now, I was a member of, it wasn't called the Monday Night Cabal, I was a member of such a dining club. There are quite a few dining clubs, but there's the idea of people sitting around together discussing the issues and the personalities of the day and discussing the things they agree on, things they disagree on, and at times finding common cause. That, I think, is that's a very human side of life in the House of Commons that, I think exists today just as much as it did when Lloyd George was Prime Minister.
I did enjoy a bit in the book where I think the Asquith government was coming up to an important vote, and Lloyd George was conveniently not around, and it turned out he was in the house of one of the Monday night cabals that was literally a 2, 3, 4 minute walk from Parliament, and yet he was...
I made the point. I mean, I put that point in to say just because he wasn't there. He was in Abbey Gardens, which is just literally over the road. And I made the point saying, I know how long it would take to walk from there to the division lobby. And he could easily have made that vote if he'd chosen to, but deliberately absented himself. As a senior member of the cabinet from a whipped government vote, which is rightly raised eyebrows at the time.
I'd say another echo with sort of that period today is political realignment. After the First World War, you had the Liberal Party breaking up, Labour overtaking them as the official opposition, and then soon the other party government. Something I've thought about in recent years is the same thing happening to the Conservatives? So even before the election, there were studies suggesting that, unlike previous generations, millennials and Gen Z are becoming more conservative as they get older. I think in July, the Tories got 13% of the under 50 vote. So I've kind of been wondering, after this last election, is the greater threat to the Tories the Lib Dems? In the sense of, you have this demographic change. Now there's only like a 50-seat difference between the Tories and the Lib Dems. So I can sort of imagine a scenario where do the Lib Dems become the main party of opposition, and then you have a sort of third right-wing party that's always there. But then you, as you kind of talked about, the Tories have a unique instinct for survival. So I'm kind of curious what your view is now after the election.
So, I mean, I think the election result, probably underrepresents the Conservatives, slightly overrepresents the Liberals. But that's the system we have does provide those, and I think it massively overstates Labour's popularity. Labour won that landslide with fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2017 when he lost. So I think if you go back to the Liberals in the First World War, I think what finished off the Liberals was a sense that, this total war and the organisation for total war was and the kind of increasing rise of the union movement, of universal votes for men and working men in particular, the power of the unions in that movement, is that the Liberals slightly got squeezed out. And in the First World War, it was one of the reasons the Liberals split, and one of the reasons Lloyd George fell out with so many of his colleagues was Liberals didn't agree with things like conscription. They didn't, they wanted to win the war by liberal means. And Lloyd George's view is, look, we either win the war doing whatever it takes, or we sue for peace. There's a pacifist party. There were a lot of Labour Party at the time was dominated largely by pacifists who wanted to end the war. The Conservative Party is out for vigorous prosecution. Lloyd George and his supporters say, well, look, if we're going to fight this war, we've got to throw everything at it to make sure we win it. Otherwise, we're going to lose. And there wasn't really a liberal position in between. And I think the space for the kind of voice of liberalism was squeezed out by events. I'd look at where we are today and say, I think Britain is basically a centre-right country. I think in terms of economic planning and strategy, people's views on taxes and spending. I think this is a country which is, I think, broadly in a centre-right position. Labour, I think, has demonstrated only wins when it can reassure people that the extra investment it might want to make in public services can be afforded, and persuading people that that's an investment worth making. Now the challenge for the Conservative Party, I think, is how you learn from the mistakes of government, how you use conservative principles to reassess the challenge the country faces and propose conservative ideas that will solve that problem. I don't think what's going to happen is the idea of a new politics where a liberal party, a sort of centre-left liberal party, is the party of opposition to a centre-left Labour Party or a left Labour Party, and that the voice of the kind of centre-right opinion in this country is not really represented, maybe by a small Conservative Party or by a further right party. I don't see that happening. I think what will happen is the Conservative Party will reorganise itself. It will find a way of demonstrating how its ideas can better achieve the results that the majority of people want in this country, and will go back with a compelling agenda and new leadership, which will attract that. I think with millennial and younger voters, I mean, it's partly a consequence as well of being in government quite a long time. And if you were a first-time voter at the last general election, you were 4 when the Conservatives were elected. You hadn't started school when David Cameron became Prime Minister. So all you've ever really known is that government, and therefore the desire for change, or the appeal of change is going to be greater when you don't know you've not lived through the alternative.
I guess for me, what the comparison I was thinking of is kind of, as you said, that the Tories had a constituency in the early 1920s. Labour had a constituency with sort of working class and trade unions, and so the Liberals were sort of squeezed out. And so I guess what I've been thinking about is, have the Tories manoeuvred themselves in having one constituency, which is, say, the over 50s, and as succeeding generations on following that same trend as becoming more right wing, are they getting squeezed out in that natural constituency?
Okay, so I think take a literally live example, because we're recording this on the 12th of September, and I was listening to Wes Streeting talking on the radio about healthcare reform this morning. Now, so if you decided that actually what we want a universal health service, we want to be free at the point of access, but we want the capacity within that service to be much greater than it is today. We want it to be much easier to see the people you need to see quicker, get the diagnosis you need quicker, get the treatment you need quicker, and then move on. Now, it could be the answer to that, which even some Labour people are calling for, is more private sector involvement in the health service. Now, actually, a Conservative Party might think, well, actually, that's an agenda we could easily support. We've always slightly favoured that. Don't want to stop it being the health service. Everything will be done under the health service, but with more private providers expanding capacity. People on the left of politics might say, no, we can't do that. It's got to be done in exactly the same way, in a universal way, by one state provider. Now, that's how you can see. You can easily have a kind of centre-left, centre-right divide. Everyone agrees on the objective, which is a better health service, but there are different roads to getting there, and those different approaches may be tested. Now, so you can look ahead and say, well, whether it's on reform of the housing market, reform of healthcare, issues that people do care about today, and younger voters care about in particular, that there are different roads to achieving those objectives. I think what happened to the Conservative Party in the last few years was its energies and its agenda seemed too far removed from those priority areas that people really wanted to see some reform and change. And people got to a point where they felt, well, I don't really fear a change of government. I don't distrust the Labour Party, and therefore I'm willing to let them have a go at solving problems I don't think the current government's got an answer to. But what will happen is that the current government will try, it may succeed and therefore prosper, it may fail, and people will look for an alternative. And I still think the Conservative Party sits in that space where it can provide the alternative. No political movement has a right to exist, but I think I still think that there is a constituency of view in this country, which is that, where a centre-right agenda of, yes, we want investment in public services, we see a role for government in helping to solve society's problems, but there is we recognise there's a limit on what governments can do, and there's a role for the individual and communities in leading that change as well. And so I think that's why I think those audiences are still there, that kind of centre-right, centre-left audience. And I think where Liberals have struggled, over the years, is that there often isn't a uniquely Liberal answer that sits in the middle between those two. So ultimately, it does become one thing or the other.
I wrote a little post last week about, I think, a danger of the Labour government, say sort of 2 months in, is it's getting caught up in a lot of minor, quote unquote, tough decisions, and spending a lot of political capital on them when they have yet to get to the big tough decisions on planning reform, NHS, or everything like that. And so I wonder if a danger for this government is similar to the Tories in the last parliament, which is that they may have a sort of large parliamentary majority, but they waste so much political capital on trivial things or marginal things that you lose the goodwill to get any big stuff through, and then you just kind of get marooned.
They're kind of banking quick losses instead of quick wins. That's which I don't think is a great way to start. And I also think as well, I don't think there are things people want fixing. There's change people want to see in the country, but Labour government's making decisions based on its priorities and how it wants to solve those problems. And people may not agree with those decisions. They're doing things the previous government wouldn't have done if it was still in power now, and therefore they'll be held to account for them. And the challenge they face now compared to 1997 is they come into where levels of tax and government spending are quite high. So it's not the easy win which you could have said in 97 is, well, basically there's enough, there's plenty of capacity to increase government spending without really having to hugely increase taxes or other things. And the question is really what we do, what we prioritize. The government doesn't have that scope now. It doesn't have that. There is no spare money, and I think therefore that requires very difficult decisions. And I think what they've not done is prepared the country for that. They didn't set out before the election the sorts of decisions they would have made. And I think looking at the majority they've got now, that was probably a mistake. They probably could have afforded to have been more honest about the decisions that would be taken, which actually I think the Conservatives were before 2010. There was some criticism of George Osborne at the time that the Conservatives, lost the chance to win with an outright majority in 2010 because they were too honest about the sorts of tough decisions on spending that would need to be taken. But in the long run, it was the right thing to do.
Another reason why I think this government might just tinker with the foundations is by sort of forswearing off the big tax rises and by sort of striking off any sort of economically meaningful reset with the EU. They just won't have any capacity to fix foundations. It might just end up be tinkering.
Well, I think the thing is they've got to have a sort of clear strategy, a clear objective, and make sure people really understand what that is, so they can go with you on the journey and they understand what you're working towards, and it's signposted and they can see the progress you're making. The danger is if you're not clear and you just say, everything's got to change and we've got to kind of plan to deliver that change, but in the short term there's going to be a bit of pain, but you can't you can't keep people on that road where they can see the big picture, they can see why the sacrifice is worth it. All they see is pain and frustration and cost, but they don't see much benefit. That's a very difficult position for a government to be in.
Another thing connecting Lloyd George's time with ours is the power of media barons, in our case, social media barons. I'm reading your book. I kept thinking how Elon Musk is sort of like Lord Northcliffe, but without the talent. You recently said that companies like X and Meta are not only dampening down on the sort of disinformation that sparked the riots in the summer, but are sort of actively amplifying it. What do you think sort of governments or regulators can realistically do to try and rein in social media barons and the problems their platforms sort of pose to society?
Well, I mean, we can set regulations around, as we have done through the Online Safety Act, on regulating platforms so that the platforms are responsible for what goes on their platforms. They're responsible for the content that they promote. And if they're promoting and hosting illegal content, content that incites racial hatred, incites violence or rioting, then they should be held to account for that legally. And so that legislation has been passed. It will be effective next year, probably. I think we'll see a real change then in what happens. But what we've had over the last few years is really calls for regulation of social media, responsibility to be held. Of course, the American companies fundamentally disagreeing with that and coming from a legal framework where they have immunity. They're regarded as being neutral. American freedom of speech laws, they feel really mean people got a right to say whatever they want, and it's not the job of a platform to interfere with that. So they come philosophically from a very different place from where we are now. But at least the companies have slightly gone along with it, which is to say, well, yeah, regulators tell us what to do and we'll work within that. I think what's different now with someone like Musk is where you've got someone who is a kind of activist tech leader with his own political agenda that is pushing that agenda hard and is acting in a way where they're trying to be defiant of governments and law enforcement agencies. The story about Twitter shutting down in Brazil is because the company is acting in defiance of court orders in that country. And I think this is the challenge we're going to see now, where governments are saying to these companies that the law of the land applies to you too. You've got to abide by it, otherwise there will be consequences. And people like Musk thinking, well, actually, we can do what we want. And I think we're seeing in America in particular now, tech leaders who are, who really see their world as being separate from the physical world of governments and borders, where the laws don't apply to them in the way they do to other people. And that's one of the challenges I think we have at the moment, which is a simple one in a way, which is to say, how do we apply the laws that we've created to safeguard people's rights and property and their safeguard their lives? How do we translate those into an online world, which is just as much as part of people's lives as the offline world is, where they're a large part of their social interaction, their working life, their entertainment is in a virtual world. Well, how do the laws we created to keep people safe in the physical world apply in those spaces?
Yeah, I guess you sort of saw that philosophical divide flare up over the arrest of the Telegram founder in France. And sort of people who were like shocked that this could happen, and then people who thought, well, it seems like a very reasonable step.
Yeah, I think the challenge there is to say, because a company like Telegram has hardly anyone working on, monitoring and enforcing of policies. If you as a company, you say, well, we have these policies to keep people safe. Take WhatsApp. WhatsApp say they don't allow illegal activity on WhatsApp. They won't tell you how they monitor it. Now they probably monitor it in some way. Do they just work on police tip-off, or do they actually monitor it themselves? How do they check when they get a complaint about illegal activity? They say they don't allow child abuse material to be distributed. How do they check that? And how do they make money out of it? Is WhatsApp this enormously benevolent world organization that allows people to make calls and send messages for free? And how they make money out of WhatsApp business is slightly clearer. But are we honestly to believe that there is no derived value from the data that is gathered by WhatsApp users? Of course there must be, but they're very secretive about what that is. So if you've created a system that you've designed to make money for you, regardless of what the benefits to the consumer are, then you're responsible for it. And that's where the challenge is coming now, which is to say, okay, are you really saying that people can organize riots, or target people with violence on your systems and you've got no way of knowing? Because, if you have got a way of knowing or raising flags or investigating, you're not doing it, then you bear some liability. And I think these are the sorts of challenges that we're now seeing.
I guess my last question is, are you working on any new books now?
Yes, I'm working on a book which really sort of will continue where Rivals in the Storm left off. Really sort of looking at the kind of the journey through the interwar period from 1922 onwards. So looking at I think it's kind of the interesting thing about, we've gone through a period of political turmoil, of rapid changes of prime minister, but you think I think one of the best comparisons to that is the 1920s. So, where we have, Lloyd George in 22, two prime ministers in 2023, in 1923, 22 prime ministers in 1924. So you have this rapid period of change, governments rising and falling. And so I think looking at exploring the dynamics, the personalities there, I think also the interesting thing about someone like Stanley Baldwin, who's a kind of largely totally forgotten figure. Politically, he managed to outmaneuver the two greatest prime ministers of the first half of the 20th century. So how did he do that? What was it what we now see as maybe a slightly bland, stolid vision of stability? What was it that made that so appealing as compared to the dynamic forces of Lloyd George and Churchill we look at now with such admiration, but were distrusted for most of that period? So I think that's a kind of interesting story to look at. So that may be where the next book lands.
I mean, something I always found an interesting contrast is there's a really great Lord Birkenhead line about after Lloyd George is overthrown and sort of the new, partly old in bone and law, but otherwise new Tories take over the party, and Lord Birkenhead calls them the Second 11.
Yeah.
And then I remember years ago stumbling on to a Path newscast of like Stanley Baldwin giving a speech to camera, and it's very modern, and sort of how he interacts with the camera, it's very modern that maybe you wouldn't expect till sort of the later TV age, and sort of how he speaks to the audience, is with the camera, seems natural, and I guess which you don't necessarily associate with the image of Baldwin, which is sort of very traditional, stolid.
Yeah. But he was the first broadcast prime minister. He was the first first prime minister of the radio age, and actually worked with and recognised the power of radio. The BBC, I think, offered radio broadcasts, I think, for the 1924 election. I think he was the only person that really embraced it and worked with Lord Reith on it. And that's how, in some ways, he was benefited from the fact you could become a national personality as a political leader through radio very quickly. And he had a speaking style which suited radio, whereas Lloyd George was brought up in the kind of, if you like, the musical era of politics, where you spoke in big venues without microphones and tannoys, and they had these sort of sing-song voices that floated over crowds. And even Churchill had changed his speaking style in the 20s to reflect the changing media. And so, yeah, I think that was definitely the arrival of broadcast media had a big impact. And you can see actually how brutal it is that you can look online at those early speeches of Baldwin's from the 20s. There are no speeches of Lloyd George as Prime Minister. There are recordings of him speaking, but those are re-recordings from the 1930s where they got him to read out some of his speeches from earlier in his career. But there is that kind of like, it's really just start from a standing start in about 1923 where broadcast media arrives, and that does have an impact in changing politics, just as the internet has done today.
Damian, thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you. Good to see you.
If you enjoyed mine and Damian's talk, it'd be greatly appreciated if you liked and recommended the show on whichever platform you're listening. Apparently, we are the 167th best politics podcast on Apple. So with your help, we can get it to 166th. If you'd like to buy Rivals in the Storm and support independent bookstores in the UK, check out my bookshop page in the show notes. Hope you'll tune in next time.